Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all know that the Palestinian Authority has not lived up to its promises, and we are talking about their incitement against Israelis and Jews. And we know that the disgusting spectacle of paying terrorists for crimes, for murderers, calling them martyrs, is just something that really irks all of us. But on the other hand, you know, you look at President Abbas. He's just completed 11 years of his 4-year term. He threats to quit all the time. I'd like to hear anybody's response about should we worry about a Palestinian, the PA collapse? There are no prize packages, but breathing down their neck is Hamas. Is that something that we should be worried about if the PA just totally collapsed? Could Hamas take over? Would the Israelis have something on their hands that they really would not want to go in and retake the area? Any thoughts of the matter? I have no regard for Abbas and what he's done, but what about the potential of the collapse of the PA? Anybody who'd care to answer? Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Engel raises an important point. President Abbas presents a mixed bag at best, and he's responsible ultimately for all of the atrocities that have been outlined this morning. But there's also another aspect, which is that collaboration between the PA and Israel is in fact quite substantial. Now, Abbas isn't collaborating with the Israeli security forces because he's become a Zionist, just the opposite. He's collaborating because it's in his best interest to do so. Why? Because if he didn't, the more extreme guys, Hamas, and now there's even more extreme guys than Hamas, would threaten the relative stability in the West Bank. So to your point, Congressman Engel, if the PA were to collapse, what we're likely to see is not a more democratic regime, unfortunately. The gap is likely to be filled by an even more extreme bunch. But let's also be fair, if we may. Condemnations of President Abbas are fair, they're legitimate, again, outlined this morning. But everyone here needs to understand what it takes in order to have an election in the Palestinian Authority. You need 3 approvals. The PA's got to approve, Israel has to approve, because you can't hold an election in Jerusalem without Israeli approval, and you got to have Hamas to approve, because you can't have votes in Gaza, unfortunately, without them. So I'm not casting judgment, but we need to be realistic about the enormous process that would need to be undertaken in order to actually have an election under the current circumstances in the Palestinian territories. You need those 3 actors to agree to some type of election administration.
Thank you. One of the things that is interesting in terms of the geopolitical movement of the Middle East is that if you talk to heads of state, the Sunni Arab states sound very similar to their perspective of the Middle East, to the Israeli leadership, to Netanyahu. He'll talk about Iran and other things, and you talk to the Sunni Arab states, it's the same thing. When you speak with Israeli leadership, they will say there's no conflict with the Arab world. There's a conflict with the Palestinians. But the Arab world, the Sunni world, sees the situation today much like the Israeli government. There is unprecedented cooperation going on behind the scenes between Israel and some of the countries that were long regarded as Israel's enemies. So it's interesting when you look at the Arab League putting forth a comprehensive proposal and a peace plan. There have been media reports recently that Prime Minister Netanyahu was open to discussing the Arab Peace Initiative as the basis for an accord. Israel rightly takes issue with several parts of the proposal, but that could be potentially be worked out. To what extent should the U.S. encourage this? Anybody else? Mr. Pollack?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question and the opportunity to reflect on it. I believe that the Arab Peace Initiative is a significant step forward, although, as you and others have pointed out, it doesn't implement itself, and it needs to be negotiated, and it needs to be revised. But I would point out that U.S. support for discussions about the Arab Peace Initiative could be an important new ingredient in this picture going forward. Secretary Kerry achieved an important modification of the Arab Peace Initiative a few years ago when the Arab foreign ministers formally agreed that Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories could be on the basis of new boundaries negotiated between the parties that would allow for territorial exchanges, land swaps, as they're often called, rather than literally on the pre-1967 lines. But that achievement, unfortunately, in the last couple of years, has been taken back, walked back by Arab governments and by the Arab League. It would be useful, I think, for the United States to go to them, to the Arab governments, and say, you agreed to this a few years ago. Can we assume that you still agree to it today? Can we proceed on that basis? That would allow for negotiations that would advance this emerging consensus between Israel and key Arab governments that peace is in their common interest. One last point about this. In late 2013, Arab foreign ministers were prepared to go even further at the urging of Secretary Kerry, but they were stopped by objections from the Palestinian Authority. This is not in the public record, but it is a fact. The Palestinian Authority objected successfully and very sadly, in my view, to a willingness on the part of other Arab leaders to accept the formulation of recognition of Israel as a Jewish state or as a state for the Jewish people. And it would be useful today for the United States to encourage those Arab governments to reconsider and to encourage the Palestinian Authority, hard as it would be, and it would be very hard, to reconsider its objections to that formulation. That could be a new and, I think, very hopeful basis for renewed peace negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.